to make sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, any questions in regards to last week? Or anything from the readings that you have done?
I never thought that my previous course, electronics, will help that much.
Say again?
Well, I dropped my course, which is electronics, but I never thought things that I learned from there is that good for understanding chapter 2.
Your course in electronics?
Yeah. You know, like oh yeah, well, action potential and resetting potential, threshold. So all of those are quite usual and common information at electronics. So good.
There's a little bit of comparison between how a computer works and how a brain works, but they're different things, really. But an action potential is really kind of a 0-1 action, right? Either it happens or it doesn't. It does not happen halfway, but I'll talk about that when we get to the neurons. Yeah. Okay, good question. Any other questions thus far? All right, so last week we didn't cover the whole chapter. The first chapter, all of the chapters are quite expensive. Sorry, not expensive, but extensive. And we won't be covering everything, but more or less 3/4 to maybe about 80%. And if there's anything else that you will require for tests, I will let you know. So today I will go over the biological basis of the brain and some of the functions that the brain performs and how they relate to specific brain areas or brain regions, how the brain communicates. So we will go over quite a bit, and then we will stop at about the case of Phineas Gage, which is a really good example of a case study, which goes back to what you have studied in chapter 1. And then we will, I think, end there. And then next week we will pick up on consciousness, split brain experiments, and then we will finish chapter 2 and move on to chapter 3. Okay, so again, just a reminder that the quiz that's set up for you, or will be set up later on tonight for you, will end on Sunday, September 26th. It will have anywhere from 20 to 30 multiple choice questions. The questions will be based on information in chapter 1 and 2. And for example, for chapter 1, the role of critical thinking or scientific thinking. Chapter 2, different brain areas or different neurotransmitters or different functions of the brain. So your task would be to identify them or circle the right answer. So that's basically the kind of, you could expect such questions. Now, each chapter, as you know, has a review section at the end of it, and that is, I think, a pretty good review for you. A good indication when you do those questions at the end of each chapter, that should be a good indication for you how much you have learned or how much you learn after each chapter. And if you don't, if certain concepts are still after reading and going over lectures, certain concepts or ideas or experiments are not clear, then you have to go back, reread, and relearn or rewatch. Okay, so that's basically, those are your responsibilities as students. Nothing new there, but a lot of interesting information definitely on a weekly basis. Okay, so with that having said, let's go into it. So let's start with plasticity, or what's called neuroplasticity. Now, some of you might know this concept when we say that the brain, when scientists or people commonly say that the brain is plastic or flexible. What does that mean? Or what do you think it means?
Programmable and reprogrammable software.
Okay, so the brain doesn't really run on any software, but it runs on specific models. So programmable and reprogrammable, if you want to use that kind of language, would mean what? I mean, what would be a good everyday example of the brain being flexible?
Like each day your brain's being shaped and molded almost.
Okay, good. Try to point to specific examples from everyday life.
I guess the adaptability and like of the environment or something like that you're in.
Okay, yeah, good, but that's still too general. Try to
Too
come up
general.
with, yeah, when I say specific examples, something from everyday life where adaptability or plasticity is exemplified.
Hmm.
So is there anything that you have learned over the last 2 years or 3 years, or maybe over the last year that you haven't, that's new in your life?
Like when you mean that, like maybe like a change in activity or something?
Yeah, anything that you do now that's become a new habit or a new activity, you know.
Like getting into online schooling, like getting used to that.
Yeah,
This
that
would
can
be a
be a
new
good
thing.
example, right?
Yeah.
Because you engage in different habits, right? It's a different environment. So now you're learning to navigate through online, just navigating through online content, right? Learning how to do that spatially, and also managing time and finding content, finding files, moving them, saving, all of that. I mean, of course, many of you know that because you have been brought up in the world of computers for many years now, but it is a new task, and it is a new responsibility. So, and it is a bit different, or in some cases quite different, from going to class in person. Even though you know, schools have been using online resources prior to the pandemic, with the pandemic we have, you know, we have been forced to kick it into a high gear of online learning. So that has been a challenge for many of us, and it has been, you know, but it has been overcome to, in some cases successfully, in some cases less successfully, from my end and from your end. Okay, so this is what we mean by adopting the brain, in many ways rewiring itself. And when the brain rewires itself to accommodate the new challenges and overcome new problems, or to master new skills, it rewires itself neuronally. So the brain constructs new pathways that perhaps existed prior, but were not as strong or were not as well solidified or crystallized, if you want to use such language. But with performing new tasks, the brain rewires itself so that it can perform new tasks or new habits well. So that is what we mean by plasticity, learning and adapting to challenges. There are many different examples. Let's say someone who learns how to drive a car for the first time. There are a lot of things you have to learn. A lot of things you have to be mindful of. So it's a learning curve. It's a learning process, and the brain has to utilize a lot of its resources, wiring resources, so that it can establish new pathways, so that the new pathways that it establishes can be used over and over again while driving. Some people, sometimes I bump into people who are adults and they don't know how to ride a bicycle, or they don't know how to swim. So for some of us, it's quite surprising. Like for myself, let's say, I've enjoyed riding a bicycle since I was a kid, and that's true for many other people. And I learned how to swim as a kid. But for some people, it becomes a new skill. It becomes a new problem or a new challenge that they want to overcome or they need to overcome. And the brain does adapt to such challenges on a regular basis. So these are just everyday examples. There are many different examples. Learning how to cook, for instance, simple things. I've had to do that when I was a student a long time ago, and I still do that, and I'm still learning new things. So there are many different things, buying a new cell phone, adopting to new applications on a cell phone, or how to navigate through a cell phone, right, or a computer. Going from maybe a MacBook to a PC or vice versa, right? You have to learn how to navigate the software. So all of this points to learning new skills, and this is representative of neuroplasticity, or the brain rewiring and forming new connections. Okay, so is that clear?
Yeah, so just to make sure, so it's basically the availability, the availability of the nervous system to change in activity.
Yeah, it's the ability of the nervous system to adapt to new environmental or cognitive thinking. Cognitive means thinking, or environmental challenges, yes.
Whether structure or functions, right?
Yeah, so the brain will rewire itself in specific ways to perform new tasks, like driving or swimming or riding a bicycle or learning content through online delivery and so on. So the brain will utilize existing resources, but it will basically now form new specializations. And it will use its billions of neurons that it has and trillion of synapses that it has between neurons in order to establish new connections. So let's say the connection wasn't there before. Now you're learning how to swim, and there's a connection made in a simple way, so that the connection between specific pathways in the brain can execute the function of swimming, as opposed to before that was not the case, okay? So in this kind of mechanical, simple manner, this is how you can imagine it. Or you can imagine a more complex web of wiring together. And this is, this is a unique feature of the brain, but it's not only unique for human beings. It's also, this feature is also available to other animals. When you talk about primates, other primates, great apes, Rodents, mice, rats, birds, many animals exhibit this feature or characteristic of brain power or ability. Now, the adaptations of brain plasticity to new challenges, environmental or thinking or otherwise, are most powerful during childhood, because the child learns a new language, learns how to navigate through its environment, learns how to socialize with its parents or siblings. But so at childhood, it is plasticity is used quite prominently or extensively. But then once you grow up, you establish specific connections in the brain, and that gives rise to specific habits. So let's say when you learn how to solve simple mathematical equations, then the connections in the brain have been formed, and then you can use them to establish new connections and learn more and more about mathematics, or it can be about language, or basically any cognitive abilities that we have or we exhibit as human beings. So the learning curve, or the curve of plasticity at the beginning of one's life, is quite steep, but then it levels off a little bit, but you never lose the ability to establish new connections or rewire the brain. It's just that it's a little bit harder later on, because in your 20s or 30s or 40s, like for myself, even though I learn new things on a regular basis, my brain has gone through what's called quite a bit of pruning. So quite a bit of habit forming, establishing specific connections. So I have now I have specific cognitive abilities because of that, and I can solve many different problems. But if there's something new that I have to learn or that I have to adopt to, then my brain goes through specific rewiring processes or rewiring activity. But that builds also on formerly established connections or pathways. So for example, some people who are blind can learn how to navigate through an environment. They can, quote unquote, see the environment by using other senses, or let's say other parts of the brain that are no longer typically used for visual processing, like the occipital lobe, will be recruited to help a subject navigate through an environment. Okay. So blind people can use echolocation. They can use sound to navigate through an environment. So vision is no longer used, but the neurons or the modules or neuronal modules that are in the occipital lobe that are normally designed to process visual information will be recruited to navigate through an environment without the visual cues. It can now, those neurons will be used to navigate through an environment based on auditory, hearing cues, auditory cues, or maybe olfaction, something to do with the sense of smell, or a sense of touch, or a sense of taste, to navigate, to create a representational map in order to navigate through an environment. So let's say for a blind person, there might be a way of recognizing sounds, pitch of sounds. So let's say a higher pitch would indicate that there is a curb ahead, or that a blind person that is touching a curb. And maybe even higher pitch sounds for taller objects or bigger objects or obstacles in front of the blind person. And then maybe different sounds or different vibrations to indicate different shapes of objects in an environment. So you can see that the brain can use different tools, other senses, in order to help compensate for a loss of vision. And this is done through neural plasticity, or basically the ability of the brain to adopt neuronal resources to navigate through an environment in a non-typical way or non-classical way. Is this clear?
Yes.
Okay. So just going back to children, it is important to stimulate children, to talk to children, to because they're learning, they're absorbing quite a bit of information, and to play with children, to have emotional connection with children, to joke around with children, to smile at them, to touch them on a regular basis and cuddle them, and because that establishes specific neural pathways in the brain. And so as basically a successful upbringing for a child is when the child is stimulated in many different ways. So that basically the brain learns how to navigate, how to adopt, how to manage environmental and social and cognitive challenges on a regular basis. But when the opposite is true, then the life of a child is impoverished. So its ability to think, to find itself in social surroundings, to navigate, to relate to other people, to establish social connections, to speak, to count, all such faculties will be impoverished, or abilities will be impoverished because of lack of stimulation from its immediate environment. And of course, the immediate environment is represented by parents or the family that the child is brought up in. And later on when it goes to school and so on and so forth. So taking care of that environment and trying to create the best possible environment is very important for a successful and healthy upbringing for a child. Now, that doesn't mean that every child's life should be, cataloged and scheduled from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. Sometimes parents overburden children and they don't let them play. They don't let them really be children because they think that, their child is going to be the next genius, and could be, sure, but they overburden. They just give their children too many things to do, So after piano lesson, we're going to do calculus, and after calculus, you're going to swim. After swimming, you're going to do ballet, and after ballet, you're going to do something else, So that is, stimulation is very important, but letting kids play and be just kids and, quote unquote, waste some time, which is really not a waste when they're playing, because they're also learning, is also important. So a balance is what parents should be aiming for, even though it's difficult because parents are really ambitious about their kids. But overdoing it is not a good thing either, because it raises the stress level and it eliminates playtime, natural playtime between children or children and parents, where there isn't so much emphasis on performance and output and grades. Yes, you can train your kids to be great athletes, but just to give you an example, I've been playing tennis since I was a kid, and I used to play a lot of junior tournaments, but my parents never pushed me. They gave me the resources to play, and I was always very athletic. But when I look at juniors who are 15, 16, 17, 18, or at least about 5 or 10 years ago, their parents are really harsh on them, and they place a lot of pressure on them to perform in junior tournaments or to become professional tennis players, which is very, very hard. It's only for select few. And they hang up the racket and they don't want to play anymore, which is sad because it's a great sport. Just because you don't go, you won't make it professionally, that doesn't mean you can't enjoy the sport for the rest of your life, or play amateur tournaments where you can make a little bit of money, but at the same time have really enjoy tennis, go through really good matches, have really good matches, that is, and pass on the skill maybe to your kids later on. So sometimes parents and like parents who have kids in hockey or other sports overdo it. They put too much pressure on kids, and kids basically start hating the sport, which is ironic because the intent was the opposite, for the kids to love the sport and exceed in them. So that is also important to remember. Anyway, let's move on. So let's go over some basic building blocks of how the brain works, what the brain is made of and how the brain works. So here's a picture of a neuron, and there are billions and billions of neurons in the brain, and there are trillions, hundreds of trillions connections between neurons. It's actually, when you think about it, it's mind dizzying how many neurons there are and how many connections between neurons there are in your brain. So that is also an answer to why neuroplasticity is possible, because if that was not the case, then I don't think neuroplasticity would be possible. The brain would be quite rigid and incapable of adapting to new environments or new challenges. So you have the cell body here. Then you have the nucleus here with specific properties, just like many other cells. And we call these dendrites, the tree-like branches that extend to terminals and cell bodies of other neurons. And then you have the axon. It's covered by this is fat. This is called myelin sheath. And so axons are covered with fat, so that the electrical impulse propagates faster through the axon. And then the terminal branches are responsible for connecting with other neurons, and the cycle repeats again and again and again, very, very quickly inside the brain. So it is kind of strange to think about that your brain, or the subjective experiences that you have on a regular basis, or the consciousness that you enjoy on a regular basis, does not feel like a neuron, but it is the basis of all of your sensations, dreams, desires. When you laugh, when you cry, when you watch this lecture, when you read, when you kiss someone, all of that is at the bottom of all of that are neurons and synapses. So it's actually quite amazing when you think about going from mental states to brain states, or what the brain is made out of. We don't know exactly what the connection is between the two, that is consciousness and brains, but we know that there's a very close correlation between the two, and in some cases causal relationships. But it is definitely a marvel of nature. There are also glial cells, or glia, in the brain that help repair neurons that are performing specific cognitive functions or functions of memory or perception or audition or olfaction, decision making, and many other cognitive abilities. And they help to repair neurons, they nourish neurons, and they also protect them. So glial cells are necessary for proper learning and thinking and memory, because otherwise the neurons that you use to perform such functions would not be able to perform them, because they would basically break down. So a synapse is basically the junction between the terminal buttons and dendrites or cell body of another neuron. And this is basically a tiny gap or cleft that is filled with neurotransmitters. So neurons really don't touch each other physically like this. There's a small gap between them, and as the message comes, is sent from one neuron and goes through the terminals, the electrical signal then is translated into neurotransmitters, chemicals that are released into the synaptic cleft, and then they are received by the neighboring neuron, and then that activity usually triggers an electric potential that goes through the neuron, and then so on and so on through other neuronal pathways or back again, because many neuronal pathways have feedback loops. Okay. So this is a good picture of the rich connections or entanglement of neurons and cell bodies. It's not a well-organized and clean place. It's basically, pretty busy and all over the place. But nevertheless, don't be naive in thinking that there aren't patterns. Specific brain clusters, neuronal clusters will talk to, quote unquote, talk through chemical messages and specific frequencies of oscillations to other clusters of neurons to perform specific tasks, like riding a bicycle, solving a mathematical equation, or driving a car. So each neuron is you could say a miniature decision-making device that reacts to excitation and inhibition. So either clusters of neurons can be either excited to perform a specific task, or inhibited in order to not perform a specific task. So imagine when you're driving a car or learning how to drive a car, you have to learn when to press the gas pedal and when to press the brake pedal, how to navigate through an intersection. So you have to basically manage excitations and inhibitions, stop, go, slow down, speed up on a regular basis. So the brain has to be hardwired for such activity. And this happens in life on regular basis with various tasks. And sometimes we are very successful in executing such tasks, where it is about managing excitation and inhibition on a regular basis, and sometimes we're not. So for example, when we drink alcohol, some parts of the brain are some parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, is unable to inhibit our emotions. And since we are unable to inhibit our emotions, whether it's anger or joy, then we get rowdy, or we get profane, or we get really, really excited without being able to control our emotions. So alcohol will do that, and stress will also do that. Some people, let's say when people are stuck in traffic and they blow up by engaging in road rage. They roll down the window and they show each other the middle finger. Because the stress level is so high, they've been so excited by anger that they can no longer inhibit their decision-making to show the middle finger or to yell at someone. Another way of explaining this or applying this to human behavior is to say that civilized people know or have learned how to inhibit aggressive or animalistic behavior. Even though we engage in animalistic behavior on a regular basis, when we are hungry, we eat. When we desire sexual interaction, we do so. When we need to sleep, we sleep, and so on and so forth, just like many other animals. But in other circumstances, we are expected in civilized societies to inhibit our actions. So in order to establish good relationships with people. So kids learn from young age to solve problems, to mend relationships, to say sorry, to forgive, to talk through problems, instead of murdering each other or shooting each other. Some people do that because they cannot control it themselves, or they have not been taught to control. But we try to teach kids from young age to be quote unquote civilized, and that means to manage excitation and inhibition in cultural surroundings. There's also a refractory period, a brief resting pause that occurs after a neuron has fired, or after neurons have fired. And it's a fraction of a second. It's you could say this is a period of rest. Or you could say, if you want to use a gun analogy, that this is the period where the neuron reloads. Okay. And it's ready to be excited again, and to fire an action potential, an electrical action potential, so that it can be received by other neurons. So the action potential, the language of excitation, is all or none response, or a 0-1, black or white. So neurons' reactions of either firing or not firing, okay? But it's never really halfway or quarter way or 3/4 of the way. And when it happens, it goes through. It doesn't stop halfway through the neuron or through the axon of a neuron. So it's not like the electrical action potential will go halfway through the neuron and then dissipate or fizzle out. That doesn't happen. It goes through. And the neurotransmitters, as you probably know, this is all common language now in 21st century. Language of neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, glutamate. acetylcholine, GABA, and many other neurotransmitters that perform various functions. We know them. We hear about them in the news. We hear about them in scientific documentaries or programs. We hear about them in common language. Sometimes people use such words with full knowledge of what they mean and how to use them, and sometimes they don't. But nevertheless, the language of neurotransmitters is common these days. So neurotransmitters are chemicals that perform the function of communicating, of connecting one neuron with another or two neighboring neurons. And then whatever neurotransmitters are left over in the synaptic cleft and around the terminal buttons of, or receiving buttons of neurons, neighboring neurons, then they are, then the process of reuptake takes place. So some of these neurotransmitters are reabsorbed by the cell bodies. Okay, so here you have the synaptic gap or cleft. You have neurotransmitters that are being released from these vesicles, and they bind to specific receptor sites on the neighboring neuron. So the neighboring neuron has to have specific, if you specific keyholes. So the neurotransmitter can be likened to a key that opens specific receptors on the neighboring neuron. And when that happens, they trigger a specific response in the neighboring neuron, or hundreds or thousands of neighboring neurons. So the action potential is electrical in nature, but then it triggers a release of chemicals. So there's an action potential, there's electrical, it's translated into chemical reaction or language, and that chemical reaction or language is then translated into an electrical impulse or action potential in the neighboring neuron, and so the story repeats, or the language of communication, quote unquote language of communication, repeats all throughout the brain, millions and millions and millions of times throughout the day. So here's the process of reuptake, where neurotransmitters are absorbed back into the cell body, or the terminal buttons. And specific drugs that we use on a regular basis to modulate human mood or behavior or cognition this is where they work. They either block a reuptake or they enhance release of neurotransmitters, or they enhance reuptake or they block reuptake of specific neurotransmitters. So there are many neurotransmitters, and they perform various functions, very important functions. Really, without neurotransmitters, neurons would not be able to talk to each other. And here I mean the word talk in quotation marks. So for example, endorphins is a simple instance of a neurotransmitter, and it's a natural neurotransmitter that is identical to the chemical structure of morphine. And chemicals such as opiates or morphine and heroin depress the neural activity. They sedate it, and they give pain release. Okay, so that's what opiates do. So, for example, marijuana is an opiate because it's used to alleviate pain. Advil or Tylenol is used. It's also a type of opiate that works on nociceptive neurons that register pain. So endorphins are produced naturally by the body, and they're usually they are produced or they're used when the body undergoes pain. So when you go to the gym and you lift weights or you exercise or you run, after or during your exercises or your exertions, the body will release endorphins to soothe the pain, to soothe the effects of your physical exertion. And that feels good. So we talk about things like runner's high, when people run and they exert their bodies to a specific level, or they push their bodies to a specific level, runners will experience the workings of endorphins, where they feel really good. We say that people are high on endorphins. This also explains why when you sustain an injury, initially you don't feel that much pain, but later on, when endorphins or the natural painkillers wear off, you really feel the pain of an injury. So let's say a sprained ankle, right after the injury, or maybe a few hours the injury, it is swollen, but it may not be as painful. But later on, maybe the next day or during the night, it will really be painful because endorphins wear off, just like all chemicals and all drugs wear off in time. And the reality of pain really hits home. Okay. So endorphins are very important, as you can see, and they help manage sensations and alleviate pain and help modulate probably behavior due to inhibiting pain or mitigating pain. But they can be also generated through specific exercises. So exercise or motor behavior is very important for the brain, but it's also very important for just feeling better, because endorphins are released when you exert, when you sweat, when you are being athletic. So here's a lesson to be in life. You should definitely be physically active. That doesn't mean you need to be a professional athlete, but you should definitely be physically active on a regular basis. Not only because it's healthy for various other reasons, but it's also the source of, but it also releases endorphins, which usually alleviates mood and just overall satisfaction on a daily basis. So this picture just represents what I was talking about earlier. So drugs like Prozac partially block normal reuptake of the neurotransmitter serotonin. Excess serotonin in synapse enhances its mood lifting effect. So here Prozac will block the reuptake. So there's actually more serotonin in the environment of a given neuron, and that alleviates that is mood enhancing. So Prozac has been used for in clinical depression, and derivative drugs of Prozac, that is. So here are just a few neurotransmitters dopamine, acetylcholine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, glutamate, endorphins. We have just talked about endorphins. So, they influence the perception of pain and pleasure. Glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter, also involved in memory. So, for example, oversupply can overstimulate the brain, producing migraines or seizures, which is why some people avoid, specific, so MSG, for instance, or monosodiums, or glutamate in food, because it affects them negatively. GABA is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter. So undersupply, if you don't have enough of it, is linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. Norepinephrine helps control alertness and arousal. It's produced by pituitary gland that is controlled by the hypothalamus. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Serotonin affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. So you can see that one neurotransmitter has many different functions. So undersupply linked to depression. Some drugs that raise serotonin levels are used to treat depression, like Prozac. Dopamine influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. So oversupply is linked to schizophrenia. Undersupply is linked to tremors and decreased mobility, as in Parkinson's disease. So we don't really have a silver bullet solution to Parkinson's at the moment. We are working on it, but we know that dopamine is part of the solution or part of the problem. That is lack of dopamine, or in this case, undersupply of dopamine in specific parts of the brain leads to Parkinson's disease. So basically the inability to control one's movements or tremors. So you can see that if dopamine is important in inhibiting movements, then inhibition is just as important as excitation of the nervous system. Acetylcholine enables muscle action, learning, and memory. So, for example, with Alzheimer's disease, acetylcholine-producing neurons deteriorate. Okay, because learning and memory are dependent on a healthy production or a proper production and use of acetylcholine. So you can see that without neurotransmitters, really, the brain would not be what it is, would not function the way it does. And in your brains right now, as you're listening and thinking and studying and planning and executing specific movements and decision-making, all of that is basically thanks to neurotransmitters. So make sure you take care of your neurotransmitters. Yes, the content of this lecture and this chapter is going to be, some of it is going to be on the quiz, yes. So for example, what functions does serotonin perform, or dopamine, or endorphins? I gave you the example of pain perception or pleasure. So I may ask you questions, one or two multiple choice questions about the function of serotonin or endorphins. Okay, what time is it? 9:30.
9:30.
9:30. Okay. Yes, the quiz is all multiple choice questions. Okay, so should we take a short break?
Yes.
Okay, so short break, 10 minutes. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Okay, so let's continue. Are there any questions in regards to what has been said thus far?
No.
Okay. Okay, so the human nervous system is divided into peripheral nervous system and central nervous system. I'm just trying to navigate with this some stuff. Okay. So the central nervous system is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is composed of the sensory and motor neurons and interneurons connecting the central nervous system to the rest of the body. And this is a very fast, very quick or fast way of communicating, the body communicating with itself and also navigating through its immediate environment. So sensory neurons carry information or messages from the body's tissues and sensory receptors to the spinal cord, and then the brain So if you touch something, or if you see something, or if you smell something, then that is propagated through or communicated through sensory neurons, or the somatic part of the nervous system. And then the motor neurons carry information or instructions, outgoing information or instructions from the central nervous system to the muscles, to the body. Okay, so if you decide to, let's say, pick up something and move it to your lips, then you will do that with your motor neurons, which have been triggered by my mind or my brain, because really the two are in many ways identical, even though we have not figured out exactly what that identity entails. And then when I touch the cup and I say, oh, I can sense that the tea in my cup is cold because of the temperature, then that is communicated through sensory neurons. And then the interneurons, of which we have, of which the brain is plentiful, are present in the brain and the spinal cord, communicate internally and process information between sensory inputs and motor outputs. So, for example, when I pick up this cup, I use my motor neurons and sensory neurons, but then I can think and linger for a second. Do I feel like another tea? Should I boil some more water? Maybe later. I already drank 2 cups. Okay, all of this is performed by interneurons between the messages of sensory neurons and outgoing motor neurons. The act of deliberating is really between incoming information and outgoing information. So interneurons, of which the brain, as I said, is plentiful, and they're mostly in the association areas of the brain. Interneurons basically play with or use information that is sensory and motor in various ways. Some imaginative, some are used for decision making, some are used for calculation and or deliberating, wondering. Okay. So here's a simple diagram of the division of the nervous system. So we have peripheral on the left-hand side and the central on the right-hand side. And again, central is composed of the brain and the spinal cords, and then the peripheral nervous system, which basically collects information from the body and from the environment as the environment triggers specific reactions in the body. And the central nervous system is basically the system that uses that information or such information in various ways to behave, to engage in specific decision making, and so on. So the peripheral nervous system divides into autonomic or autonomous or automatic, which is self-regulated, and it's related to specific functions of internal organs like the heart or lungs, gallbladder, stomach, just in the internal milieu of your body. And then the somatic part, where you sense the external world or the internal world of your body. So, for example, specific nuclei in the hypothalamus or the brainstem will regulate or control specific organs. and you don't need conscious awareness or volition to do that. So, for example, your heart is regulated like that, and your heart also has a central pattern generator, a specific nucleus in its muscle, so that it beats rhythmically. Okay, but you don't really control that consciously. What you can control through biofeedback is your own interpretation of how excited you are about certain information. Okay, so let's say, for instance, mindfulness training or meditation or relaxation methods are about basically modulating biological markers, so the workings of the heart, and maybe the workings of the lungs. But lungs will expand and contract naturally, autonomously, but because the function of lungs and heart and our digestive system is related to stress levels, and stress levels can be modulated by the central nervous system, that is our interpretation of stress or the way we cope with stress. That is one way of, through biofeedback and other mechanisms, cognitive mechanisms, ways to modulate specific bodily functions that are really autonomous. And then the autonomic nervous system splits into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic system arouses the human body to perform specific actions or behaviors. And the parasympathetic has the opposite effect, and it has the effect of calming the body or or various organs in your body. And the somatic, as I have said earlier, divides into sensory input and motor outputs or skeletal muscles. So again, when I decide to pick up this cup, then I'm using my skeletal muscles, because I'm using the motor neurons are connected to muscles, and they relax and contract muscles to engage in specific behaviors or actions. So here is also a good division of the workings of the autonomous or automatic nervous system. We have the sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic sympathetic part arouses the body to do specific things, or arouses the central nervous system to do specific things, and the parasympathetic has the opposite effect. So this is well exemplified during moments of stress. So when we encounter stressful situations, such as writing a test or writing a quiz, going on a date, driving test, maybe just before hopping on a roller coaster, or maybe bungee jumping. I mean, many different things can be stressful in life. Then the parasympathetic system will kick in very quickly. So the pupils will dilate, so there's more, so that there's more light entering the eye. So there's more information, basically. The heart rate will increase. Digestion is inhibited. You don't feel hungry when you are stressed out or in a stressful situation, because that is not time to digest food, but that is time to act. So this is also synonymous with the fight or flight response. So for example, when you're walking, you're going for a hike, and all of a sudden you see a small animal that maybe looks like a bear or maybe looks like a dog or a wolf, you don't really quite know, then that is going to kick in, that is going to trigger the sympathetic nervous system, or the flight or fight response. So it's called flight or fight because you have to make a very quick decision whether you should fight the obstacle or whether you should run away from it, or whether you can just ignore it. Okay, that is an assessment you have to make very quickly based on the incoming information. So you look at the animal and you say, oh okay, it's not. You take a couple of seconds to estimate and to interpret very quickly, and or to get closer or to see better, in order to determine whether it is actually a dangerous animal or whether it's not a dangerous animal. In such a case, you can relax a little bit. Okay, but if it is a dangerous animal, or if you're walking down the street and all of a sudden a car comes from around the bend, then that is going to trigger that response almost immediately. So you can speed up or get out of the way really quickly. And for that, you need sugar, which is located in the liver. So ATP molecules will be released into the bloodstream, and sugar. Yeah, sugar is going to be broken down into ATP molecules, which are basically molecules of energy, so that you have the energy, the resources to run or to fight or to withstand some sort of danger, or to hide. And the adrenal glands are stimulated, that are on top of your kidneys, and the adrenal glands will release epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is basically adrenaline, so that you can sustain a certain level of stress, or in this case, stress means readiness to fight. This also stimulates the male reproductive organs. So when there's arousal in the central nervous system, there's also arousal. There's also sexual arousal, and this is normal. And the opposite is true. So the opposite would be true as it is performed by the parasympathetic system. So again, there's the reversal takes place: contraction of pupils, slowing down the heart rate, stimulating digestion. So now you can digest food so that it's later on ready, transformed into energy and glucose, so that the liver can store glucose and other chemicals so that it can release when it is ready, when it is needed. Contracts bladder, but when the nervous system is excited or in a fight or flight response, it relaxes the bladder, but it contracts the stomach or inhibits digestion. So this is just a basic overview of one of the segments of the nervous system. And the two work basically in a push-pull manner, or they engage in a push-pull relationship, causal relationship. So one is active, the other one is inactive. And when the body is ready to relax, the parasympathetic system kicks in, and it relaxes the body, and it allows it to regenerate, sleep, and relax, which is very important. It's very important because high levels of stress that need to be maintained for a long period of time will break down all the organs in the body and will kill the body. Okay, high levels of stress for a long time will basically kill you, because the body does not go through the proper, you could say, refractory, as with neurons, or proper parasympathetic time, which is time to replenish and renew its cells while sleeping, build new peptides, new proteins, and save nutrients or chemicals for hard times to come. So it's basically time of replenishment, eating, digestion, sleeping, resting. And when that does not happen, your organs cannot recover. And when they don't recover, they break down. And when they break down, you get sick. And when you get sick, you could die. That's basically the causal chain of events. Any questions here? So as I said, the brain contains billions and billions of neurons, and it even contains more synaptic connections between neurons. And the spinal cord is basically a way of connecting the body to the central nervous system. And when the spinal cord is cut, then that usually results in paralysis, coma, or death. Depends where it is cut. So here's a simple reflex arc. So when you touch something hot, there's a natural reflex to recoil from, let's say, a burning sensation, and that is autonomous. But a copy of this information is sent to the brain. Okay, so you can learn from it, and then you can also make different decisions in the future. So animals learn pretty quickly, and children learn pretty quickly, and adults learn pretty quickly from negative experiences. Positive experiences as well, but negative also, and we learn, the learning curve based on negative experiences is higher. That is, we learn faster from negative experiences, because in the future we want to avoid them, and the avoidance reaction is basically to protect the body and to protect the autonomy of the individual. Sort of an individual. So the central nervous system is basically a system to communicate. So for the central nervous system to communicate with itself, because the brain talks to itself on a regular basis. Simple example of that is when you make decisions, you talk to yourself. You might not be vocalizing your thoughts the way I'm vocalizing my thoughts right now through speech. Okay, there's a specific motor output to what I'm thinking, but you might be thinking to yourself, okay, should I do this now or should I do this later? Will I have enough time later on? Will I be on time, etc., etc.? How much time do I need for specific things to do? Okay, all of that takes place in your brain, and it involves billions and billions of neurons, mostly interneurons, in association cortices, to make a decision. Okay, so that is basically a way of communicating. The brain is communicating with itself in order to execute specific decisions. or to react to specific pieces of information. So that's one way of one type of communication system inside our bodies. The other one is the endocrine system. And the endocrine system does not depend on the central nervous system. I mean, it does depend on the central nervous system, correction, but the way it executes its decisions, it's through chemicals, neurotransmitters, and it is slower because of that. And the reason for that is chemicals linger in the bloodstream much longer. So when you get angry, you stay angry for some time because there's this amount of specific chemistry or hormones or neurotransmitters that are in your bloodstream, and they, you peak and then they will dissipate in time. That is not the case with neuronal communication, which is it's partly based on neurotransmitters, but it's also partly based on electrical communication that's much faster. So let's say you're angry at someone, you may partly forgive them, but you may still feel anger. You may still feel the emotional effects of being angry, or you may still feel stressed out. So it takes a while to come down. It takes a while to get back to normal state. So this is where specific glands are located in the body for both genders that are responsible for releasing specific hormones or neurotransmitters into the bloodstream. So we have the hypothalamus that is located in the limbic system, and the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland controls all the other glands throughout the body. So the thyroid and parathyroids and the adrenal glands, pancreas, that are located in your on your kidneys, and pancreas, and then you have testes and ovaries for women, and testicles for men. So when you look at adrenal glands, here it says in the lecture note that they trigger the fight or flight response. And when the stress level is prolonged, it really lasts for hours or days, you will feel pain, physical pain on your kidneys. In the back, you will feel on both sides pain in your kidneys because the adrenal glands are overworked. So just like muscles, excuse me, when muscles are overworked, you experience pain. A similar situation is with the adrenal glands. Okay. So I talked about the adrenal glands, and the pituitary gland releases hormones and sends messages to other endocrine glands to release their hormones. So it is controlled by the hypothalamus, and it's called the master gland. Now, historically, people like René Descartes, who was a well-known mathematician and a philosopher, thought that the pituitary gland is the place that the mind connects with the body. So the mind can control the body and can relate to the body or can work with the body because of the pituitary gland, and that's where the connection is. I mean, that was about 400 years ago. We can forgive René Descartes for such a blunder, but today we know that that's not the case. We know that the pituitary gland is a master gland that controls many other glands throughout the body. And here, part of its function is to control growth hormones that are responsible for physical development, oxytocin levels during birthing, for instance, for women, and orgasm for both genders. But oxytocin is also released when we establish love and friendship between people. And oxytocin is also established between when we establish in relationships when we trust others. Okay. So let's look at the brain, the different structures of the brain now. And here, as a critical thinking note, going back to what I said last week, when I was talking about the importance of critical thinking and scientific thinking, the famous or infamous claim that we only use 10% of our brain, and you will see that where this comes from, and that it is a bogus claim. It has no merit, basically. It is untrue. Here's a look at the brain from the outside. And this is where your consciousness and all your wonderful sensual and emotional and cognitive experiences take place. It's in this thing called the brain. It's quite amazing. It doesn't look like, it looks like what? What does it look like? It doesn't look too pretty, does it? But it is where the magic of consciousness and your conscious life takes place, believe it or not. So in today's neuroscience, the science of the brain, that is, specific tools enable us to look inside the brain or what is happening inside the brain. However, when you look inside the brain, you won't find consciousness, and you won't find the self, and you won't find self-identity. The magic happens when the brain comes together. And it's only possible from the first person perspective, from being a subject like yourself. Because when I take a specific tool, like let's say electroencephalogram or PET scan, I will be able to read specific neuronal activity or the way neurons talk to each other, but I will not see consciousness or the person that you are, or your dreams and desires, or other things that go in and out of your consciousness on a daily basis. So with the advent of specific technologies like EEG, for instance, that uses electrodes placed on the scalp. So if someone has, let's say, insomnia, and they suffer from irregular sleeping patterns or lack of sleep, then they will go into, he or she will go into a lab or a testing center, and a cap with electrodes will be placed on their head in order to record neuronal activity, electrical activity throughout the brain while the person is trying to fall asleep or is sleeping, in order to find out, okay, is there anything irregular about the brain? Is there something abnormal about electrical activity in the brain that is the cause of or triggers specific symptoms? Positron tomography relies on radioactive form of glucose. So you attach a radioactive agent that is benign to, let's say, glucose, and then you follow where glucose goes, or where it travels and how it is metabolized. Kind of like a flashlight. You're following a flashlight in the brain. Magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, I'm sure you've heard this term many times, or fMRI, which is a derivative technology. uses magnetic fields and radio waves to produce computer-generated images of soft tissue. So it's perfect for various tissues, including soft tissue like the central nervous system. And then the functional magnetic resonance, resonance imaging is for revealing blood flow and brain activity by comparing successive MRI scans. So here MRI reveals blood flow and therefore brain activity, kind of like in a second by second snapshot. So it is accurate in terms of placement, but not very accurate in terms of time, because it takes time to take one snapshot and then another and another, and then you can compare them. So it's a slower time scale, but it's accurate in terms of placement. And really, without such techniques, we wouldn't be able to peer into or look into the brain. Now, there are other ways, of course. Neurosurgeons look at brains as well when they cut specific tissues, or when they cut out tumors, or when they cut out specific parts of the brain to alleviate epileptic seizures. But they have to know where to go and how much to cut, and that information or that knowledge is based on previous experiments or previous surgeries or previous experiments on cats and dogs and other animals, or previous experiments on stimulating specific tissue, brain tissue with tiny electrodes or electrical activity in order to see if there is any reaction. So first done in animals and then also later on in human beings. So here we have a comparison between a healthy brain and the brain of a schizophrenic patient. You can see that the healthy brain is on the left-hand side, and the unhealthy brain is on the right-hand side. You can see that the ventricles, let's say the arrows pointing to the midline structure of the brain, the cortical midline structures, are bigger. They're filled with more liquid. And also on the peripheries, you can see that when you go north or top here, you can see that the fissures between cortical folds are bigger than in the normal brain. They are more filled in the normal brain than in the patient who suffers from schizophrenia. So here you are, now you're a rodent. And but don't worry, later on you're gonna turn back into a human being. This is just for the purposes of this lecture. So rodents, I'm just kidding around, but rodents are, in many ways, we conduct many experiments on rodents, and because they're very similar to, their nervous systems are quite similar to our nervous systems, although the structures in our brains are bigger, some are more extensive or just richer. But the basic building blocks and architecture and evolutionary development is very similar. So for example, in less complex vertebrates, like let's say mice or rats or rodents, you will find smaller brain parts, but you will also find very similar brain parts. So for instance, in rodents, you have a brainstem and the limbic system and the neocortex. And so is the case with human beings. And sometimes specific areas in rodents, brain areas will perform a few functions together, as opposed to in human beings, where maybe there's more brain parts or more extensive parts, where the labor of processing information or performing specific functions is performed by more brain parts, or different regions, that is. So more complex brains in advanced mammals include humans, enable the ability to plan ahead. But that probably is not the case with rodents or lower mammals, although rodents like mice and rats are quite intelligent. So the complex brain in lower mammals, such as rodents, enables emotion and greater memory. The less complex brain in primitive vertebrates handles basic survival functions that are identical to human functions. So the brainstem is the oldest and innermost region of the central nervous system, and it's important for autonomic survival functions such as breathing, eating, sleeping. Okay, so the medulla, for instance, is placed in the brainstem that controls heartbeat and breathing. Pons help coordinate movement and control sleep. And really, without these, you wouldn't be able to survive, nor could any other mammal. So when human beings sustain brain damage due to perhaps professional sports or car accidents or just motor vehicle accidents, that could be either devastating or just fatal for human beings because of the damage sustained to the central nervous system. So here we have the brainstem, you have the medulla, the pons, and then you have the reticular formation that is responsible for streamlining information that goes to the thalamus, and then the thalamus is composed of thalamus means chamber, and it's composed of about 50 different nuclei that receive information from various senses, such as, let's say, the visual sense. Information will go to the eye and then through the optic nerve into the thalamus, into a specific nuclei that's called LGN, and then that information is then relayed from LGN. It's very quickly processed and streamlined so that it goes to specific parts of the brain in the occipital lobe, for instance, V1 or V2 or V3. V here stands for vision. So as I said, the thalamus controls is the control center, sensory control center, apart from the smell. So olfaction, or your smell, has its own cortical area, but it doesn't go through the thalamus first. Olfaction goes straight to the olfactory bulb, and then there's also right next to it a brain area for processing it, or for re-representing olfactory information and connecting it with other brain parts. But apart from that, all the other information, all the other sensory information goes through the thalamus first and then to cortical areas. It transmits replies to cerebellum and medulla. That is important. The cerebellum is located in the back of your brain, and it's responsible for various functions. But one of the main functions is to maintain bodily balance. So the reticular formation, the nerve, is the nerve network that runs through the brainstem and the thalamus. It filters and relays information from the spinal cord, and it also is responsible for cortical arousal. So when the reticular formation is damaged in animals or human beings, then human beings or animals go into coma. Okay, almost automatically, because there's no arousal of all the other parts of the brain. Therefore, the eyes don't open. There's no information coming in through the eye. There's no way of stimulating, exciting the rest of the central nervous system, because the brain part that is responsible for doing that is shut down or broken, just like if you were to shut a door or blow up a bridge between two banks. So again, the cerebellum is responsible for various functions, but judgment of time, discrimination of sounds, and texture, emotional control, so inhibition, just like the prefrontal cortex, but also coordinates voluntary movement. And so athletes, where's mine? So here's a picture of an athlete. And if your cerebellum, that is located here underneath the occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, is damaged, then you wouldn't be able to play soccer, run or balance the body in any way, ride a bicycle, walk. It would be very difficult. Okay. So the other part of the brain, moving upwards through the spinal cord, is the limbic system. And the limbic system is basically the emotional center of your body, or your central nervous system, that is. And it's composed of the hypothalamus that controls the pituitary gland. And remember, the pituitary gland controls all the other glands, such as the adrenal glands that are located on your kidneys or in your testes or ovaries. The amygdala, that is responsible for representing aggression and fear, and hippocampus, that's responsible for memory, spatial memory, and also forming new memories. So moving information from short-term memory to long-term memory. But I will talk about that later in the course when we talk about learning and memory. So the amygdala is a 2-lime bean kind of sized neural clusters in plural that enable aggression and fear and are linked to emotions. So if you stimulate the amygdala of dogs or cats or rodents in specific areas, then with electrical stimulation, that is, very small electrical stimulation, you either will get a very aggressive reaction or a fearful or sedated reaction. And it's the same for human beings. So damage to, let's say, amygdala due to viral infection or motor vehicle damage due to a motor vehicle accident, that is, may result in people who do not have fear at all. So if there are people like that, well, let's say their amygdala has to be removed, or it has been damaged, or there has been a stroke. People like that will not be fearful of the typical things that people are fearful of. So let's say, cars on the roads, maybe a person with a gun, people like that are not afraid of them at all, of such people, that is. Maybe, I don't know, touching something that is really hot. Maybe again, there might be pain, but there is no fearful reaction to it. So fear is very important because it controls behavior and prepares us for future intentions and behaviors. And it's also important for learning how to navigate and how to adapt to environments. So is aggression. It is also plays an important part in how we function as human beings in society in our immediate environments. But being fearless is basically synonymous with suicide. Because when if you don't experience fear, your days are basically numbered. Sooner or later, something will kill you because you're unable to recoil in fear, to protect yourself. The hypothalamus is linked to emotions and reward. If you stimulate rodent brains in a specific part of the hypothalamus, they will experience ecstatic states or a lot of pleasure to the extent where if you have a lever or a pedal and rodents learn that when they touch it, it's connected to an electrode that's connected to their hypothalamus, which releases a pleasurable state, they will do that ceaselessly until they drop out of exhaustion. So it is. So experiments like that have taught us that rodents or other animals, lower mammals, have specific centers responsible for pleasure or reward in the brain, specifically in the limbic system, that is quite similar to human beings. And the hypothalamus is positioned below the thalamus. And as you know by now, it is responsible for coordinating or governing the endocrine system via or through the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is responsible for processing consciously information and then moving that information from, let's say, short-term memory storage to long-term memory. So explicit memories of facts and events is linked to the processing conducted by the hippocampus in the limbic system. Damage to hippocampus results in loss of memories. So if you have a damaged hippocampus, you might be unable to recall memories of past events. So let's say what happened to you last year on your birthday. Your friends might remember, your family might remember, you will have no access to that information. In some cases, people will suffer from short-term memory loss, where they cannot form new memories. So, they have working memory, let's say for anywhere between 30 seconds to a minute, but after that, they lose the information. They don't retain the information. So if you introduce yourself to such a person, a few seconds later, they will not remember that you have just introduced yourself to them, or to him or her, that is. So here's a pictorial representation of the limbic system in reference to the neocortical or the cortex. And the cortex is basically the convoluted, folded sheets of neurons that wrap the limbic system that is here. You have the thalamus, and then you have the brainstem here and the cerebellum here. You have the visual cortex here, or the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe here. You have the frontal lobe here and the temporal lobes here. But there will be a better picture to show that. Interestingly, damage to the skull and damage to the brain, such as concussions, negatively affect or damage the brain. So concussions are quite detrimental for the brain. Here's an interesting study where neurologists and neuropsychologists analyzed the brains of 111 deceased, that is dead, National Football League players. 99% showed signs of degeneration related to frequent head trauma. So the protective gear that players wear is very important, but at the end of the day, if someone is a boxer or a football player or a rugby player, sooner or later they will sustain damage to their brains, and which could lead to specific cognitive impairments or even suicide later on. I'm not trying to deter you from football or boxing, but just be mindful that the brain is delicate. It is encased by a cranium, by a skull, by a bone, but still the brain moves in the skull. So when two players collide together, when they let's say they collide head on, the brain still moves in your cranium and it hits the wall of the cranium. Okay, so it basically smashes against the wall of your cranium, and that could produce severe damage to the brain, especially when such actions are repeated. So if you don't have to do that, don't do it. So here's a pictorial representation of the different lobes. So you have the frontal lobe, and that includes the motor cortex, and then you have the somatosensory cortex, which starts the parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And here you have a different picture or different visual access to the brain cut in a sagittal manner. And this is the sort of the limbic system here, and the neocortical areas around. So you have the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, and the frontal lobes here. If you extend into, if you were to imagine the whole brain. And of course, all the lobes function together, they communicate together. The brain is really a bunch of neuronal loops held together. Okay, so information reverberates, cycles back and forth in the brain on a regular basis. That's why you have repeating thoughts. That's why you mull over information. That's why you can have access to memories, and you can have access to specific, you can imagine scenarios. You can plan ahead in your mind for the next day, okay? Because the brain has constantly accesses information or re-accesses information that is readily available, okay? So the frontal lobe is not, it's not encased in its own domain or environment, and then you need a specific key to open it, and then the parietal lobe can connect to it. That's not how it happens, okay? Many of the clusters of neurons that are in the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex are connected with the parietal lobe, and that is connected with the thalamus and the temporal lobe and the cerebellum, okay? So almost all brain parts are either directly or indirectly through interneurons connected with each other. So if you electrically stimulate the motor cortex, that will trigger specific bodily movements, okay? The motor cortex is located at the junction of frontal lobe and parietal lobe. And so for instance, the German researchers in the 19th century, like Fritsch and Hitzig, would stimulate with an electric, with a little bit of electricity, the brains or the motor cortex, or the brains, that's how they discovered the motor cortex of cats, and the cats would engage in would have specific reactions or specific behaviors. And then in Canada, Penfield and Forrester mapped the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. Now they were able to do that in the 30s and 40s because during neurosurgeries, because the brain doesn't have any pain receptors. So you can conduct, once you open the cranium, you can conduct experiments on the brain. You can stimulate the brain while the patient is awake. And when you stimulate the brain, the motor cortex or the somatosensory cortex, in order to, let's say, find out exactly which parts of the brain you want to remove, if you want to remove, let's say, epileptic seizures or tumors, so you're kind of mapping, you're probing the brain in order to map when specific sensations start and end, let's say, in your tongue or on your nose or on your lips. But all of this was possible because the brain, you can be awake while you tease the brain or stimulate the brain with electricity. So many of these experiments were conducted in Montreal, where Penfield was a neurosurgeon. So here you have the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. So the motor cortex is in kind of violet or grayish blue, and then the motor cortex is in orange. And this is basically the representational map. So the parts of the body that you use the most, and that the parts of the body that are used for complex behaviors. So you can do many things with your hand, and you can see that a lot of the real estate of, or area of, the motor cortex is devoted to the hand, and much less to the knee, because the knee is not as versatile, it's not as flexible as the hand. So since the hand is quite versatile, you can position it in many different ways, and you can use it for various functions. It requires more brain area, and basically you could say more brain power or computational power in order to execute such maneuvers with your hands. The tongue, also the mouth, the face, you can see that the mouth, because we use the mouth to speak, to vocalize specific sounds, you can see that there's quite a bit of cortical area devoted to the mouth, as opposed to, let's say, the eye. Okay, the eye has engages in specific movements, but you can't really compare the complexity of the movements of the mouth and the jaw and the tongue to the complexity of the movements of an eye. And the same thing for sensations. You know, a lot of sensory cortex, somatosensory cortex is devoted to the hand again, and much less to the, let's say, hip. Okay, because we perform very complex behaviors, and due to that, we need to have many sensory areas activated on our hands or on our lips or on our mouths in order to talk and to sense things that we eat and use our tongue, as opposed to other parts of the body. Let's say your toes. Okay, your toes are important, but you don't perform as many tasks with your toes as you do with your hands on a regular basis. Therefore, there's corresponding motor area and somatosensory area to facilitate such behaviors. complex behaviors. So you can see our lips are quite sensitive. And when you kiss someone, it feels good. It feels good because a lot of cortical areas is devoted to sensing stimuli that are coming through the mouth. And of course, this is not only for behavior of courtship or sexual behavior, but it's also, useful for, testing food and items. Especially kids put a lot of things into their mouths because that's one way of sensing, of testing, or monitoring what they are experiencing. And that is the reason why kids don't put things under their knees, but they put things in their mouths, because the mouth can detect a lot more information about the child's environment. So again, the somatosensory cortex processes body touch and movement sensations, sensitive to body regions, directly related to size. Okay, and I have already mentioned that. So the more cortical size is devoted to a sensory region or motor region, that means that body part is used for various functions, or such a part is used for various complex functions. The visual cortex is located in the back of the brain, or the back of your cranium, okay, right here. And the visual cortex is quite big, because you could, I guess you could say that vision is our dominant sense, but our other senses are also very important. So hearing is very important. Producing speech, and let's say understanding speech is also very important. But we enjoy listening to music. We can distinguish music, different sounds, different pitches, different tones very well, just like we can distinguish different colors and movements, visual movements in our visual fields. So the visual cortex is in the back of the brain. It connects here with the temporal lobe, and up here with the parietal lobe. And information that goes to temporal lobes and parietal lobes and occipital lobe goes first through the thalamus. Here's a picture of an fMRI picture of cortical connections of a person who is under the influence of LSD. Is a hallucinogen. So it's a psychoactive drug, often which produces hallucinations. Which produces hallucinations. Why? Well, one of the reasons we can infer from this picture is that it dramatically increases communication between visual cortex, which is in the back, with other brain regions. So the parts that are lighting up is that the parts that are have increased metabolic processes, or increased metabolism. And increased metabolism is basically associated with more activity, as opposed to a person who is not under the influence of LSD or other hallucinogenic drugs. So one way to explain the wild or vivid hallucinations is that because apart from visual hallucinations, the stimulation of the visual or the occipital lobe, there are also other widespread connections with the occipital lobe, between the occipital lobe and other parts of the brain, that is. Okay. So the functions of the function of the neocortex as opposed to the limbic system or the brainstem is basically to perform and learning, thinking processes, remembering, using speech, understanding language. And this is quite complex. You know, just think about when you use a specific language, whether it's your native language or English, or when you're learning English, or when you have a pretty good mastery of English language, how complex it is and how many words you have to remember, and you have to use them grammatically and accurately, and so that is quite a bit. And a lot of this action takes place in the neocortex. So in the four lobes, that is the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital, you will find the prefrontal cortex, which enables judgment, planning, and processing of new memories. This is quite a lot. Judgment and planning, that requires a lot of information processing. And damage to such areas usually results in impairment in judgment or planning. So when you register for your courses, or when you have to go to work, or when you have to study, or when you have to plan for a day, that involves quite a bit of cortical real estate. It actually involves the whole brain, but specific parts of the brain are more active, more involved than other parts of the brain. So we know that from case studies and other accidents, from neurological cases and from neuropsychological cases or assessments and therapies, damage to the frontal lobes can alter individuals' personality, so that's quite a bit. Damage to parietal lobes can lead to loss in mathematical and spatial reasoning, which is also quite a bit. And damage to the the underside of the temporal lobe can result in the inability to identify a person. And there is a specific part of the brain that's called the fusiform area, which is responsible for identifying human faces, so seeing human faces and also identifying human faces with specific people. So people who undergo damage to temporal lobes or the underside of temporal lobes, especially in the fusiform area, will be able to point to specific parts of a face, but will not be able to identify the specific parts of someone's face with a person that they used to know, like a grandmother or a father or a mother or a friend. They will look at you and they will not recognize you. Yes, they will say that you have a nose and you have eyebrows and you have cheeks, but they will not know that they are your eyebrows, your cheeks, or your nose. So here's a well-known case of a railroad worker, Phineas Gage, who suffered a very bizarre and traumatic accident when a tamping rod or a packing rod to pack dynamite into rocks, because that was the technique to blow up rocks, blow up basically obstacles to lay down railroads, exploded and basically shot through his skull, as you can see here. So it went through his left cheek, through the eye, he lost his left eye, and through the frontal lobes, but more specifically prefrontal left cortex. So miraculously, he was able to talk and he was able to sit, and he lived for many years after. But he was a different man altogether. He lost his job because he was no longer capable of maintaining his responsibility as a supervisor, and that was very indicative of his inability. That was due to the fact that he was not able to plan ahead and execute decision making. So now we know that we know that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning ahead, conducting and engaging in executive decision making. Should I do A or should I do B? Which one is better? Which one would be faster? Which one would cost less? Go ahead, yeah. Question.
Oh yes, sir. Did this accident cause emotional disability to him?
Yes, well, in a way that he was not able to inhibit his aggression to his coworkers, so he became really profane. He was swearing left and right. He was not able to control himself. So it really changed his behavior. So it didn't change him in the way that he maybe experienced anger or joy, but he was not able to modulate or inhibit or to manage his emotional reactions. So people, his coworkers, would report that he was no longer the same man or the same person as prior to the accident. Although, you could engage in a conversation with him, but his cognitive abilities to make plans, to make executive decisions, and his abilities to engage in proper relationships with other people was affected. So in some cases, neuroplasticity can repair damage or can compensate for brain damage that then results in specific cognitive impairments. But in some cases, that is not possible. So for instance, in the case of children who suffer damage to temporal lobes, especially in the area called the fusiform area that is responsible for recognizing human faces. When children suffer this damage, they lose the ability to recognize human faces. They do not regain that ability. Other parts of the brain do not sweep in or help in order to restore such a function. But in some other cases, neuroplasticity is quite flexible or plastic, if you will. And neural connections can be molded and rewired to compensate for specific losses. So in some cases, some brain functions are forever lost, like in the case of Phineas Gage, or some children whose fusiform areas in the temporal lobe are damaged. But in some cases, like in the case of, maybe I can find it here. Just to go ahead. No, I won't find it here. But there's a nice picture of a young girl's brain, and her almost entire right hemisphere had to be removed because she would go epileptic seizures on a regular basis, and that prevented her from normal life. So a lot of the brain area was removed, or cortical area, and not only cortical area, but entire, you could say 3/4 of her right hemisphere was removed. But because she was 5 or 6 years old, a lot of the brain circuits in her left hemisphere compensated, not overcompensated, for the loss that she suffered due to brain damage or due to losing the right hemisphere. So she was able to, laugh and to engage in speech and to play with other kids and to attend ballet dancing lessons. So she more or less grew up to be a normal kid, maybe with slight deficits, cognitive deficits, but nevertheless was able to live and to grow and to participate in all the activities other kids were able to participate. So this is a good example of neuroplasticity, and it's quite amazing because the child had lost almost an entire hemisphere. Okay, so just one half of your brain, if you will. So I think here we have a picture of the two brains. So this one. Yeah, so here this is. I will get to this next week, but here you have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and if you look in the picture in the chapter 2, that is, you have a picture of this young girl, and when you look at the picture post surgery, you can see that in the picture her right hemisphere is almost entirely missing. So let's say this is the left hemisphere, but in her case, it's the right hemisphere would be all gutted, would be all removed because of specific abnormal neural activity that would cause epileptic seizures where she could not participate. She could not be a normal girl. So just to end on brain parts, and we will call it a day. So corpus callosum is the part of the brain that connects left hemisphere with right hemisphere. And it is basically a band or a bundle of neurofibers that connect both hemispheres. So both hemispheres talk to each other through the brainstem, but also through the corpus callosum. Okay, so information in your left hemisphere travels to right hemisphere through the corpus callosum and vice versa. Okay. So when neurosurgeons have to cut corpus callosum in order to alleviate brain seizures or epileptic seizures, that is, they cut and they split the two hemispheres. So in this condition results from surgery that separates the brain's two hemispheres by cutting the fibers. And that creates an interesting phenomenon where you can see that you can set up specific experiments where you show some information to the left hemisphere. Let's say you show information to the right hemisphere through the visual field, but that information is not then translated, so not communicated to the left hemisphere. So you may see something, but you will not be able to say what it is because the information does not travel from, let's say, the right hemisphere to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is responsible for speech. And if you read through the experiments on split brain patients, you will find out more about this. But I will get back to this next week. I think we should leave it here because that's quite a bit of information. And we'll pick up next week on the split brain and consciousness, and after that we'll move on to chapter 3. Okay, so before I let you go, yes, any questions?
Yeah, but since I'm not good at speaking, I type my question into the chat.
You're fine at speaking. Well, the binary system, I mean,
Just like direction of action impulse. Does it
Mhm.
working like that?
Well, the
Image?
action impulse is binary in the way that it's on off. So that's the only way that it is binary, but I don't know if it can be related to any other uses of binary, or if you mean something else by binary here.
Just A to B direction, not go backward from.
Yeah, so there is movement from, let's say, there's always feedback movement. So information, let's say, will go to the thalamus, and then it will go to the visual field, number one. In visual field, there will be processing, but that information will go back to the thalamus and back again, like this. So there's recursive information exchange in the brain on regular basis. Yeah.
Oh, so that's the reason if one part of brain tissue is removed, then we cannot do some certain action. Oh, I get it.
Yeah, exactly, because there isn't the representational map where information can be processed visually or auditorily or otherwise is missing. So neuroplasticity may help in this case if other brain parts compensate for the missing functions due to damage or surgery. So let's say if there's damage to the occipital lobe, perhaps in some way the temporal lobes or the parietal lobes can compensate for such a loss. But if vision is damaged in the occipital lobe, because we see through the eye and through the brain, right? If the eye is damaged, then you won't be able to see. But if the brain is damaged, then you won't be able to see either, even though your eyes are healthy, right? Because information needs to be processed by the occipital lobe, right? So no, but if you damage, there's a case called blindside. If you damage, and this was found based on cases on chimps, and if you damage the V1 area of the visual cortex, that is the occipital lobe, but all the other parts of the visual cortex are intact, then patients will say that they don't see anything. But if you ask them to walk through a room with chairs in the room, they will walk through the room quite fine. They will be able to navigate through the room, but they won't be able to say that they have actually conscious, he or she has actually conscious awareness of the chairs around them. So yeah, so it's called blindside. A very strange phenomenon that was discovered in the 70s in monkeys, but it works the same way in human beings. So now patients like that do not recover conscious vision, but they do have vision, unconscious vision. And it turns out that there are two visual streams in the brain, one dorsal, one ventral, and one is for processing information consciously, and the other one is for processing visual information unconsciously. But I don't know exactly how that fits into binary systems, but I know that the brain is wired up recursively. It's always talking to each other and exchanging information.
That is the whole question that I wanted to ask. So
Okay.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Good question. Thank you. Jin, any other questions? Okay. So let's call it a day here. And I will email you. I will send you an email and also post a news item in terms of your quizzes. And I will open the quiz soon, maybe today, latest tomorrow, and then you will have tomorrow and the rest of the weekend to to do the quiz at your own time, but so let's say the quiz will be open for, let's say, 30 minutes. But you will be able to, you will have one chance to do it, but you will have, at least 3 days, choose any of the 3 days or any time during the next 3 days to do the quiz. So you have that flexibility.
Will it be open book test?
No, it's not an open book test.
Oh, okay.
Any other questions? Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you very much. And also thank you, Jin, for questions. And stay tuned for my message about the quiz. And apart from that, I will talk to you and see some of you next week. Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Take care, Professor.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Have a good day.
You too.